fallacies and faith.
Hello and welcome to another episode of my Theistic Pearls of Wisdom series, where I choose posts and comments from Facebook discussion groups and comment on them from an atheistic, naturalistic and obviously my own personal perspective. Today's pearl is very short and it distinctly lacks sweetness. My dear atheists, why do we all die? I am tempted to pose a counter question like, why would we not all die? To this poster, but alas, a video like this is a one-way street and I will have to try and come up with a response. But let me first point out again that being an atheist does not mean that you suddenly are an expert in biology, physics, cosmology, or even philosophy. And whatever question the believers like to level at us, as if the fact that we might or might not be able to answer them is somehow a gotcha moment that will rattle us out of our atheism and convert us to whatever religion they happen to follow. That is a ridiculous notion. It does not get them one step closer to demonstrate that the God they proclaim is real. One line that I often use as a response to questions like these is, the fact that I, or that science does not have an answer to a particular question does not and will never become evidence for the existence of any God. But before I get to my response to this particular gotcha question, let me point out that death and dying is actually, as with everything that causes unnecessary suffering, a theistic problem, especially when an omnibenevolent God is the God proclaimed. Death does not make sense under such a worldview. Why would this God not immediately create us in the eternal place? Religions have come up with all kind of excuses like, this is a fallen world that we have to go through and suffer because of sin committed by the first humans who were driven out of paradise. But how does that make sense at all? Muslims always claim that this life is basically a gullibility test, and that the most gullible, those that kiss the backside of Allah the most, will be the highest in paradise. Not to mention that all of these religions set up rules and regulations that supposedly come from this God that no normal human being will be able to fulfill. All Abrahamic religions judge and condemn humanity based on the mere fact that we are humans. The human condition itself is sin. To quote Christopher Hitchens, once you assume a creator and a plan, it makes us objects in a cruel experiment whereby we are created sick and commanded to be well. I repeat that, created sick and then ordered to be well. End quote. And let me add that the only remedy that we somehow must seek is forgiveness from this God. That can be achieved according to each religion in different ways, but it has to be done before we die, otherwise it will have dire consequences. With the next quote about death, I am revealing my deep-running German roots and my love for what are called singer-songwriters. The song itself has been released when I was but 11, but it might have taken a few years until it got to me. I simply do not remember when I heard it the first time. The song is called Noch hab ich mich an nichts gewöhnt, and it's by German singer-songwriter Heinz Rudolf Kunze, and he wrote it in 1981. Zum Beispiel, dass ein naher Mensch vor Schmerzen schreit und stirbt. Der Tod schlechthin, ein Fakt, das nicht für Gottes Schaltplan wirbt. My attempt at a translation goes something like this. For example, someone close to you cries out in pain and dies. Death itself presents a fact that does not really advertise well for God's wiring of our bodies. This was one among many lines in songs that brought me to think deeper about this whole idea of God the designer and the existence of God in general. Again, it makes no sense for a perfect being to devise such a scatterbrained scheme and plan our bodies in such a flailing and failing way. This has already gone on longer than I planned. See, I am not perfect. But suffice it to say, under a worldview that presupposes a God, death makes no sense, and the believer, the religions, have to come up with strategies and apologetics to integrate it into their teachings and beliefs. Not so in a purely naturalistic worldview. Again, this is not atheism giving an answer to the question, but biology. Being an atheist means just not being convinced, not believing that any God exists. There are no answers to scientific questions in atheism. And I am not a biologist, so please understand that what I am saying here is just my very limited understanding. It is based on my school biology and whatever I have read or heard later. Enough preamble, let us start. Death is not only a biological fact, but it is a necessity for evolution to occur. To enable the new generation that contains minute changes in their DNA to thrive, the older generation must disappear. It must die. Simple as that. If we look at the first cells, which replicated by simply splitting up through mitosis, copying their own DNA into the next generation, changes occurred only rarely due to copying mistakes. Hence, evolution during this time was a very slow process, and if one looks at it, it means that since these cells produced copies of themselves, they were kind of biologically immortal, because a copy of them always went on. But all that changed when cells started to have sex. When they started to exchange DNA, suddenly the newly produced cell was different from the cells of the old generation, because they held the combined DNA. That meant that if the older generation died, that form was ultimately lost. So basically, sex and death entered this world together. I know this is such a simplistic view that any biologist would slaughter me for even presenting it in that way. But again, that is my understanding, presented in a kind of weird way. So to go back, for evolution to work and be effective, death is absolutely necessary. For one, to give the new generation the resources to thrive, and another factor to prevent interbreeding of old DNA with new DNA. For us as humans, that means in our body millions of cells die every single day. These need to be replaced, but that replacement happens imperfect, and the older we become, the less perfect it is. And at some point our body will fail because of these imperfections. Death is basically pre-programmed into us. And I hate to have to use words like programmed when talking about biology, because as we all know, creationists and ID proponents will pounce on it and say, see, if it's programmed, it is intentional and needs a programmer. But it doesn't. Biological processes are sufficient to explain such effects. In any case, it is not my area of expertise, as anyone who has listened to what I said before surely would immediately realize. So, to reiterate, death is a necessary part of biological life, because without it, evolution could not happen as it does. The end. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Theistic Pearls of Wisdom and will join me again the next time on this channel. Enjoy this life. It is the only chance we get as far as we can tell. See you soon and goodbye. I heard it all before. Is that all you have in store? Is there really nothing more than just fallacies and faith?